Folks joining has slowed down a moment, so let's turn the program over without further ado to our amazing president, Dr. Carolyn Burns. Dr. Burns.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that introduction. And good evening, everybody. It's really we're glad to have you with us tonight. We're calling this an extra RAM meeting. I hope that you've all been safe and staying well. I'm encouraged that we're getting a lot more Virginians vaccinated, and hopefully that means we'll get back to some form of normalcy soon. Since we're still unable to meet in person, but very much want to connect with our members, we've been busy trying to secure additional programming that we think would be of interest to you. We can't wait to hear from Dr. Winn, but before we do, I'd like to remind you of a few upcoming events. The next Lunch on Tuesday program will feature Dr. Greg Hunley, director of VCU's Pauley Heart Center. Join us on Tuesday, May 11th at 12:30 to learn about the use of cardiovascular magnetic resonance to assess patients with cardiovascular disease. You asked and we heard, now that medical cannabis is legal in Virginia and cannabis pharmacies are coming online, you wanted to know more. So join us for a 3-part medical cannabis series starting in May. We will kick the series off with a program on May 12th, which will be an overview of the science and data behind medical cannabis, and which will discuss the clinical indications for prescribing. On June 16th, the program will review the legal and practical issues of how to recommend medical cannabis to patients, and the final program will conclude the series with a look inside an actual medical cannabis production operation and pharmacy on July 21st. Check out the website for more details. Then take your family out to the ball game. On August 21st, we're going to have a picnic, baseball game, and fireworks. And at the conclusion of the game, the fireworks will be set off. More details are coming soon. We're looking very forward. We're very much looking forward to finally premiering our 200th anniversary video on September 21st at the Jefferson Hotel. So please come and learn about the Academy's incredible history and why the patient's advocate, the physician's ally, and the community's partner isn't just a catchy tagline. And let's not forget our 200th anniversary gala at the Main Street Station on November 13th. Finally, our favorite member family events are going to continue this year. We'll host the annual Fall Family event at Lloyd Family Farms on Sunday, October 10th from 2 to 5, so come get your pumpkins. And our popular family night at Lewis Ginter's Garden of Light, Fest of Lights on Sunday, December 5th from 5 to 8. RAM continues to support the members not only with the programming, but also with the up-to-date online COVID-19 Resource Center with all the latest information needed for us to help our patients. If RAM can help you in any other way, please let us know. And now for tonight's presentation. Don't forget, CME is available. Be sure to follow the instructions to receive the credit, which were included in your meeting confirmation email, or will be found in the follow-up email you will receive from tonight's presentation. I'd also like to remind everyone that the presentation will be recorded, and a link to the presentation will go out tomorrow in the leg up. Please don't be shy to ask questions this evening. Use the chat feature to pose your questions, and Jim or I will read it to Dr. Winn at the end. Slightly before the pandemic hit, a RAM member approached us about inviting Dr. Robert Winn to speak to our members. He said he'd been a hit. Dr. Boyd Linslow was fortunate enough to hear Dr. Winn speak at a Kiwanis luncheon and said about this presentation, he delivers his vision for the Massey Cancer Center and by extension, medicine in Richmond and Virginia in a manner that is electrifying. And to top it all off, he's engaging, friendly, open-minded guy with an earnest desire to build bridges with every facet of the medical community here. Just meeting him made me feel like a better person. How could we say no to that glowing recommendation? So I'd like to introduce you to our colleague, Dr. Robert Winn. Dr. Winn was appointed director of VCU Massey Cancer Center on December 2nd, 2019. In this position, he oversees a cancer center designated by the National Cancer Institute that provides outstanding cancer care, conducts groundbreaking research to discover new treatments for cancer, and offers high-quality education, training, and community outreach programs. In addition to directing the activities of Massey's 205 research members, researchers and physicians from 38 departments and 3 colleges and 4 schools at VCU. He is also a pulmonologist who manages a research laboratory at VCU. His current basic science research, which has been supported by multiple NIH and Veteran Affairs Merit Awards, focuses on the translational aspects of the role that proliferation pathways and cellular senescence play in lung cancer. He has authored or co-authored more than 60 published manuscripts in peer-reviewed academic journals. Further, Dr. Winn is committed to community-engaged research centered on eliminating health disparities. He is a principal investigator on several community-based projects funded by, excuse me, the NIH and National Cancer Institute, including the All of Us Research Program and NIH Precision Medicine Initiative. He has received national and international acclaim for his efforts to empower underserved patient populations, improve healthcare delivery, and ensure equal access to our cancer care. The recipient of numerous awards and honors, Dr. Winn was awarded the National Cancer Institute Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities Cure Program Lifetime Achievement Award. Winn holds a bachelor's from the University of Notre Dame and received his MD degree from the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor. He completed an internship and residency in internal medicine at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago and a fellowship in pulmonary and critical care medicine at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center in Denver. Welcome, Dr. Winn.
Well, thank you very much. And I really appreciate the invitation. And I want to thank Jim and Dr. Burns and Laura for really just being amazingly wonderful partners and just wonderful hosts. So thank you so much. I am going to take a little bit of time to unpack a little bit of this issue around disparities. This is probably going to be a different kind of talk. I would liken it to Billy Preston. For those of you who remember Billy Preston, or those of you who remember who the 5th Beatle really was, which is Billy Preston. He had a song that said, "Will it go round in circles?" And it started off that song that said, "I have a song, it ain't got no melody, but I'm gonna sing it for my friends." Well, this talk is going to be a little bit different than most of the other talks that I've given, because this is really going to be really more of a talk about an aspiration and hope that I believe that why in Richmond, we've come at the right place at the right time in history to literally do something big and lead the country and where we're going to look and what we can look like over the next 50 years. And so it's with that hope and really with the passion of understanding that this is done not in a vacuum, but together, that I really love where I am and being among you. I'm reminded also of Vince Lombardi, who I know some of you probably follow football. But even if you don't follow football, you know something called the Lombardi Trophy that happens with that little thing called the Super Bowl. Anyways, Vince Lombardi was an amazing guy and New Yorker all the way down to his heart. And I think when he wound up getting his first real big coaching job at Green Bay. His daughter was super distraught. In fact, I think her words were, "What are you doing? No one knows where Green Bay is." Vince Coach Lombardi, without missing a beat, essentially sort of said, "Well, when I'm done, everyone will know where Green Bay is." And in some ways, I think that we have a renewed sense of what Richmond is and what Richmond can be, and where we are taking, I think, as historically, where things happen in Richmond, things happen across the country. I really feel that we have that intersection now. So it's within that spirit that I'm going to share my screen and give this talk. And let me see if this works. It does work. This is great. I love it when these things work. I know I still get excited by it. So we're going to talk a little bit about disparities tonight, but in a different sort of sense. We're going to talk about structure, why race, and why these other things still matter. Now, I start off with this slide because I really level set myself with this slide, as I do almost with all my talks. One, to tell you all, which some of you may know this already, but me to level set myself about really this issue around values. This slide talks about when values are strong, rules are unnecessary. But when values are weak, rules, and I don't care how many rules you put in place, tend to be insufficient. And I think many of us have seen examples of that in our lifetime. I want to tell you that I have had a number of people in my life throughout my time at Notre Dame and at Michigan, but throughout my entire career that have level set for me what it means to have values. And I have to, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about John Lewis and Elijah Cummings, both who succumbed to cancer. But both men, including Danny Davis, Bobby Rush, Dick Durbin, and others, have been really central to me in this concept of values. Now, I think many of you remember that Elijah Cummings once said, "We've got to keep working together until there is no more disparities." And Lewis, how could you forget what he said? "Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get into good trouble, necessary trouble." And the trouble we're going to get into tonight is how we all in the Richmond Academy of Medicine really lead the way, and I believe this with no hyperbole, and Richmond, our communities, how we come together to sort of bring about a sense of renewed sense of enthusiasm and energy for medicine and for what we can do in the United States. It was no mistake that Dr. Jill Biden made her very first visit to Richmond. And in fact, many people wondered, well, why would her first official visit be to Richmond? And in fact, it's because she has three things on her platform. One is education, military families, and cancer. Many of you know that she had a son, Bo, who died from cancer. But what many of us did not know is her passion as an educator to understand that the connectedness of, while science can thrive, if it is not connected to communities, it's only half as good as it could be. And so her statement about health inequities have lasted far too long. And when she actually heard about what we have been doing in some of the activities of really bringing science closer to our community and coming up with the new 21st century model of how folks within the community can help refine the scientific questions of our faculty, I think was intriguing to her, to Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, and Ned Sharples, who's the head of the NCI, National Cancer Institute. I'm reminded, just for level setting and just for frameworking here, that we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the war on cancer. Now, back in 1971, they did something that was big, bold, and brash, the kind of good trouble, the necessary trouble. Necessary trouble there was to make sure that we understood that while many academic centers were doing some things against the fight against cancer, and the NIH was doing something against the fight against cancer, because they were not aligned, many of which and much of what was happening was okay, but not great. So two men, Richard Nixon, who gets the credit, but over Richard Nixon's shoulder, right shoulder, is Ted Kennedy. So the two of them got together and said, let's do something big, bold, and brash. And they really have a war on cancer by establishing the NCI designated cancer centers, which are almost deputized cancer centers. Now, many of you know that there are well over 5,000 cancer centers in the United States, but only 71 have been federally designated. Massey enjoys being one of the early designees in 1975, and then UVA. We're blessed to have these two academic institutions as part of our state. But it's not enough to be designated for me. I know what we've done in the last 50 years, but the question is how can we reimagine and recreate designated cancer centers for the 21st century, for the next 50 years. We understand that research has been the bedrock, but we also understand that as part of that research, improving health in rural communities, improving health at-risk communities also matter. In that context, we've enjoyed a lot of success. I remember when Francis Collins was then a geneticist back at the University of Michigan, who really lit the flame for me while I was taking his class and doing some other things with him that really got me excited about what can happen with the genome. This is just a little thing for modern healthcare that talked about the genomic medicine goes mainstream. But we've also, with technology, have done just amazing things we couldn't think about 30, 40, 50 years ago. We now have things where, for example, you could use your phone with the right adapter and diagnose your own kidney stone, as Eric Topol once proudly sort of said he did, or cardiac valves, or other things like that, with just your cell phone. We also understand the power of, as people sort of said, precision medicine. And in fact, I was one of the early adoptees of what the power of the Precision Medicine Initiative could do together. And so I got a group of people together at University of Chicago, Phil and Northwestern, Phil Habib and Dr. Phil Greenland and Habib Hassan together with me to put together what then was called the Illinois Precision Medicine Consortium. I believe in the power of science. Listen, at the end of the day, and I think some of you may have heard me say this, but if loving science is wrong, I don't want to be right. I love science. And I understand what the power of science can do as we talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, et cetera. I also was part of a historic AACR Cancer Disparities report, the 2020 report, which is the first of its kind that was made to Congress. It was received well by both the Democrats and the Republicans and the independents. And bottom line, what we said in that report is that we are certainly making some progress. In fact, the black-white disparities with cancer deaths, we can look at other diseases, chronic diseases like this, and I'm sure we'd probably see similar results. But from 1990 to 2016, we've made a difference. 1990, the black-white disparities of cancer deaths was 33%. It's now down to 14%, which is what we cited in the report. But having said that, there's still disparities. Now, listen, we know that with Latino children and adolescents, they're 20% and 38% more likely to develop leukemia. We understand that Asian Pacific Islanders are twice as likely to die from stomach cancer as their counterparts. And yeah, by the way, men living in Kentucky who have lung cancer and their lung cancer incidence and death rates are 3.5 times greater than those men living in a place like Utah, for example. Now, let me level set when I talk about disparities. We understand that black-white disparities still exist. It's gotten better, but it hasn't been eradicated. And like Martin Luther King, I too have a dream. I have two dreams. The first is that we eradicate, hopefully, cancer within my lifetime, and that we're a part of that. And the second is that hopefully we eradicate disparities in my lifetime. Those are my two dreams. We have some work to do. We understand that even with all the new technologies and even with the miracle therapies like immunotherapies, there still remain an immunotherapy divide. And unfortunately, access for all doesn't exactly always mean access. I tell you this because I want to actually paint this picture that this isn't new. Disparities have been documented since 1899, and the fella pictured to your right there is W.E.B. Du Bois, a famous academic, a famous thought leader around these issues, who in 1899 wrote an exhaustive study called the Philadelphia Papers, in which he described unequal housing, unequal employment, unequal policing. Does this sound familiar? As ways in which we have unfortunately advantaged some communities and disadvantaged others. These same themes rolled through the 60s and 70s. In fact, post the root causes of the Watts riots, we came up with interesting things like in 1965, high unemployment, poor schools, inferior living conditions, residential segregation, and police discrimination. So let me stop and pause for a second and tell you that the issue of health disparities has been with us for a very long time. I'm going to liken this a little bit to a diet. You and everyone else knows that there is data that supports that losing weight is good for us, and that weight loss comes with significant benefit. We also know that there's probably 5,000 or more diets that you could choose from. And if you picked one and you committed to that, anyone, and committed, you'd lose weight. Health disparities is similar to that in the context that we've studied it since 1899 and following, the following decades. We've even come up with blue ribbon panels, the best of the best in the country, from the educational arena, the health arena, the political arena, and the business arenas, and have put together blue ribbon panels that have actually addressed the how we could actually reduce health disparities. So this thought of re-examining the health disparities and coming up with new solutions makes some sense, but we need to actually frame it in the context that these things have been done before. And in fact, sometimes if you just take off some of the solutions that we've actually written from those blue ribbon panels and blow off the dust on some of them and commit it, we probably would be able to address this issue. So it's, as Julian Richmond sort of said, it's not so much that we don't know how, we don't have the will. And for those of you who are counting, Julian Richmond's important in my life because he was the guy who created what's called Head Start. I am unapologetic about the fact that some of the programs that were started in the 60s, the federal programs, were actually did work the way they were supposed to and intended to. Having said that, there was certainly no surprise for many of us when COVID hit that those disparities would be exacerbated and seen by many. Now, COVID did one thing that we couldn't do. This is a little bit like seeing the abominable snowman. And I would see, and many of the people who live in my communities would see the abominable snowman and report that we've seen the abominable snowman, but no one believed us. It wasn't until we had to stop with COVID and with other things like George Floyd, when all this stuff came crashing. You all remember about a year ago when we're talking about March, April, around that area, March, April, May, where we were. I had to stop. And for the first time, not only did I see the abominable snowman, but others were now able to pause and see this abominable snowman called racism within the United States. Now, I was very moved by my dean, Dean Peter Buckley, who, when many of us were taking knees throughout the country, he went with medical students and other health faculty and leaned and took a knee for 8 minutes, 46 seconds. And I think his words to me was, during that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, he felt like it was a lifetime. And in fact, it was a lifetime. I'm reminded of this because recently, of recent events, I have had to, the uncomfortable sort of situation of having to sometimes relive some of the trauma that as a young man, not so young man, I wish I could say it was a young man, that I've had to endure myself. I wrote a piece for the Cancer Letter called Reflecting on the Cancer of Racism, and really put this title, which wasn't meant to be provocative. I could have been George Floyd. It wasn't meant to be provocative. I could have been George Floyd because there were a number of times where I was the only time, and I grew up in some rough neighborhoods, so I'm not saying that, but the only 2 times in my life that I've had guns pulled out on me weren't by people in my neighborhood. It was really by the police who were stopping me because driving DWB. And for those of you who don't know, DWB was literally driving while black. Now, listen, before you get going, I want to be honest with you that I also am not anti-police. My brother, as a result of some of overhearing those conversations, those tough conversations my dad had to have with me about those issues, became a police, and a very good one, to be quite honest with you, who worked tirelessly in police reform and better policing. In fact, to be honest with you, I don't know many of you who may have family members that are policemen and policewomen, but you worry about them. So this is not a talk about anti-police. It's really a talk about how we all can be better, including our policing strategies. I say that because over the last couple of days, I've had to relive this trauma. And many of you have probably heard this now that it's been sort of making the headlines and social media and on TV, but it's been tough for me to watch this young lieutenant who's similar to me, almost verbatim, with 2 policemen drawn, weapons drawn, and you're like, what did I do? Like, literally, what did I do? And when he ultimately said, I'm afraid to get out of my car. And they said, you should be. This was as if this was a nightmare being relived for me personally. Now, I understand my role as an African-American doc in Cancer Center. One of the things I love about Richmond and one of the things I love about VCU is that of the 71 cancer centers, it was VCU that said, we enjoy your vision, how you can love science and bring science closer to the community, and how those 2 things are not at odds, but should be connected and together. And in fact, we buy your vision and we want you to be a cancer center director. It was not lost on me that it was a proud moment in Richmond, where it's a proud moment for Virginia, where I became then the only African-American cancer center director in the country of a designated cancer center. And if I'm being honest with you, I have roots that go way deep. My grandmother, and she'll tell you, is from here. To be exact, what she'll tell you is that you have to go from Richmond to West Point, Virginia, and through West Point, Virginia to Middlesex. And then on the other side of Middlesex, there's a little town called Sulu. Anyway, she's on the other side of that. I think we have shown as a medical community some amazing grace and hope that actually I really do think will be used for the rest of the country to look and to think about. But we do have a reality. Let's not forget, 1918, there was also another respiratory illness. So again, we've been caught up with the racial unrest and the pandemic, but pause. In 1918, we had the Spanish flu pandemic. It ran from roughly about 1918 to 1920 or 21. 675,000 lives were lost as a result of that pandemic. But 675,000 lives were lost in the US alone during that pandemic. But many people forget that during that same period of time, we probably had the greatest number of racial unrest and the greatest number of deaths that were racially related. Not only did you have issues in Chicago and other things, but you had things in 1919, what's called the Elaine Massacre, that happened actually in Arkansas, over really an unjust system in which these men were simply just asking to, who were working the field as sharecroppers, that ultimately they needed to be paid. And there was this massive sort of pushback, and some things happened that led to 200 plus people being massacred in a single day. Just quit playing. This issue, racial unrest and pandemic, we've been here before. My hope is that unlike that period between 1918 and 1921, the Tulsa massacres, et cetera, but what did we leave behind? What will we leave behind that will ultimately help the people following us about how to get through a pandemic and racial unrest? Hopefully, if all things with fingers crossed go right, we'll only be dealing with a pandemic that happens every 100 years or so without the racial unrest. Look, there's a little Amy in all of us. So come on, let's not play. Amy Cooper was not a bad person. Her dog may have been misbehaving, but she was not a bad person. But she had a lapse of judgment when she called the cops on Christian Cooper, an African-American, avid bird watcher, who ultimately said in the New York Park, hey, listen, your dog, look at that dog, needs to be on a leash. This is when I first got an epiphany that racism wasn't so much a personal issue as it is a systemic and structural issue that impacts all of us, even in medicine. Recently, you all probably were well aware of the JAMA podcast, in which we had a person who actually seems to be a reasonable academic physician, essentially saying no physician is racist. There is no such thing as structural racism in healthcare. And that really, this talk about structural racism, really just made white doctors feel uncomfortable, because there's no such thing as racism. I wish I were saying that this were 2 decades ago, or a decade ago, even 10 years, 5 years ago, but this was on March 4th, 2021. The acknowledgement that in the hallowed halls of academics and in our halls of health systems and in science, racism still exists. Let's just be honest. Like COVID, you can be an asymptomatic carrier. We learned that one of the things that was interesting at the height of COVID is that people say, I feel okay. There's nothing wrong with me. And we knew that some of the asymptomatic carriers of COVID were super spreaders. This isn't really a talk to indict anybody. This is a talk for me of hope. That by simply being able to use data and simply being able to have what my grandmother would say, the 2 guiding principles of any successful life is grace and humility. And by the use of grace and humility, we can become better. It's important because grace and humility actually equals trust too. Now, interesting enough, the only beef I ever had when I brought Fauci here, and he and I laughed about it. So before he actually did the call with everybody, when I invited him to come and he came, one of the things that we were bantering about is I said, Dr. Fauci, I love you, and I know you're grouchy, but I know I love you. But the one thing I'm going to disagree with you on is this issue around comorbid diseases in African Americans, as if there is some inherent DNA issues, not understanding that structures, i.e. the zip code and neighborhood association, sometimes predisposes people, right? The environment, the microbiome, and all these other things can impact, right, your DNA based on your environment. So there is this interconnectedness, and we'll come back to that. But the one thing I wanted to point out to this one with Dr. Fauci was that as we created the miracle of the vaccine, and we called it warp speed, and we patted ourselves on the back, and we delivered the sort of message that things are great, there was vaccine hesitancy. And in some cases, outright refusal. Now listen, I'm reminded during Watergate that President Nixon once famously said, just because I'm paranoid does not mean that people are not after me. There needed to be, through the medical community, grace and humility given to communities that actually have suffered. Dr. Marion Sims, the modern day of father in surgical oncology, and work done back on then slaves that were not even anesthetized to perfect techniques that we use today. Issues around, we call it Tuskegee, but I don't. I call it the United States public health efforts of 1932, right, to better understand syphilis, right? Now, someone asked me once, well, why would they choose African Americans? Well, if you go back through the papers before 1932, there were these little interesting, and I get this from Dr. Otis Brawley and some other historians, that they felt that because apes never really got syphilis, that African Americans would probably be more resistant. Now listen, the truth of the matter is people were doing what they could do back then. And I would have gone back in time and cautioned folks to pause. Simply pause and really think through what it is that we're talking about as we move forward and we talk about science. Now, there's no debate that we do have disparities. And interesting enough, it even shows up in very interesting ways, like the Cleveland Clinic, where you have this story where the Cleveland Clinic grows healthier while its neighbors stay sick. At Cleveland Clinic, even though it became a global success, its communities within blocks were mired in poverty. So again, we have this disconnect, right? Let it be known that one of the things that we have skirted around that becomes important is to be understanding of structure. This is a picture of Chicago, but I could put one up of Richmond. I could put one of many cities throughout the United States during that period of 1930 to 35. Now, what was happening during the 30s, 33? Remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually came up with a policy that said every person should actually have access to a home. Signed off on it. But there were others who said, yeah, that might be true, but we don't have to be living next to one another, blacks and whites. And so we had the Homeowners Loan Corporation policies of 1933 onwards, up until literally the 60s, and some would even say till the 70s, that separated people. Now, think about this. I'm going to make the pitch to you that separation, right, then would allow folks to have access to maybe better foods, access to better healthcare, access to better transportation, access to things that would allow, if you believe in epigenetics, and if you believe in the microbiome, to thrive, where their DNA wasn't so insulted, where others that will live in poor areas where there was less access to healthcare, less fresh foods, less of these things, that their DNA would be under insult. There is not this disconnect between your DNA and your ZNA. What I'm proposing, and the big idea here, is that there's an intersectionality of your zip code neighborhood of association and your DNA. Now, for many of you who say, oh, okay, come on, Rob, this is all about, let me just also dispel one myth. When I'm talking about disparities, let's take race out of it for the sake of argument. Let's say that from a DNA, we understand that your zip code neighborhood association probably has 80% more of an impact on your life expectancy than your DNA anyways, but just suspend for a moment that this is not a black-white thing. Talk to me about the fact that race could be a social construct. And as a social construct, it still relates to, even if race is not the issue, it relates to your DNA. As a social construct, the policies of 1933 and 35 allowed people to be excluded for some areas. Okay. Hold on to this point that I think is actually an interesting one. Norway, which I actually believe has to be one of the most homogeneous places on the planet, you can see an 8-year gap in life expectancy. That's also disparities. So when I think about disparities, take away the race issue. When I think about disparities, it really means there is a disparity, and let's use life expectancy as a measure. If there's an 8-year gap in Norway in a homogeneous group, it allows an academic, someone who's at least moderately curious, to say, why? This is what health disparity is about. It's not whether you're rural or whether you're Black or whether you're Asian. Where do you see the gaps? And once you actually can identify the gaps by data, you can then lift the hood, and now there's a series of questions that says, why does that gap exist, as any good scientist and academic would? And once we actually identify those, we can now come up with interventions. That is the new model, right? The two principles that take away race. Although you may be able to take away race biologically, but you can't take away the fact that race as a social construct still puts you in structures that through epigenetic mechanisms, microbiome, and other things could potentially put under duress DNA in one population that it doesn't in another. Having said that, this is Chicago in the 2021. We see tremendous black-white differences, or this is where most of the African Americans, Latino, live in the South and West Sides, just like they did back in the 30s. And interestingly enough, the highest rates of lung cancer mortality, South and West Sides of Chicago. Worst outcomes for birth rate, South and West Sides of Chicago. Worst cardiovascular disease, South and West Sides of Chicago. And in fact, I can go on and on and on. And interesting enough, I can do the same thing in Virginia and certainly in Richmond. Why does ZNA matter? ZNA matters. This is just a depiction that tells you that within 4 miles, if you look to your right, the Loop is a place where Oprah Winfrey or Keanu Reeves, when they went back to Chicago, would hang out. I mean, it's called the Magnificent Mile for a reason. 4 miles away, or the equivalent of 6 train stops, you get to a place called West Garfield Park. There's a 16-year difference, life expectancy. And worse and more obscene is if you go south 8 to 9 miles in a place called Inglewood, the life expectancy is 30 years difference. Now, you'd say, oh, Rob, the 30-year difference and 16-year difference must be explained by gun violence. We looked. It was negligible, almost non-existent. That when you take the number of lives that are lost by gun violence versus just the number of lives lost, it doesn't even add up to really a hill of beans. It's chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, strokes, diabetes, cancer. Why is that important? It's important because this is just something, a slide that I needed to just show you real quick, and I won't spend much time. But the pink ribbons were set there in Chicago, where the American College of Radiology breast imaging centers of excellence were to be placed to reduce the burden of breast cancer. My daughter at the time, when I created the slide, was younger. She's in college now at NYU, but she said, Dad, I don't get this. And she goes, the pink are where people are dying the most, right? And I said, you're right. She goes, and the pink ribbons are where they're supposed to be there to reduce people dying in the pink. And I said, yeah. And then she said, Daddy, how come none of the pink ribbons are actually inside the pink then? Out of the mouth of babes. That was my aha moment where Willie Sutton sort of said, you know, why do I rob banks? I rob banks because that's where the money is. But are many of our efforts where the money is? So I'm here to talk about the power of reconnecting what I call, or what Perel P. Freeman calls, the critical disconnect. And that is, we've been enamored by the power of research and discovery sciences, but it's been disconnected to the implementation of those discoveries into our population. And I would even dare say that there's another disconnect between the implementation and health delivery systems into our communities. That is what we're trying to do. That's the big deal here. Traditionally, academic cancer centers have focused more on the fundamental research that are downstream factors, but I think it's becoming apparent to everyone that we need to actually think about not only the downstream biomarkers and all the wonderful things that I love, the RNA binding proteins, which, believe me, I think is a sexy field and am working on right now, bringing that to the attention of everyone of how important RNA is. But I must admit that a discussion without the upstream determinants is only half a discussion. So I'm getting close to the end. We've done great with genomics. I mean, we have genomics up the yin yang. We're doing great things with phenomics, tumor types and vital status and demographics, but we're missing an omic. And that is the omics of community, which I'm coining from one of my junior faculty who I brought here from Chicago, named Dr. Catherine Tosis, where we were coming up with this title of omics and the community omics. That is the built environment. We rarely even ask people the social determinants of health at any time when we're actually talking about our patients. And yet, those social determinants of health, of housing, of education status, of transportation issues, of do they have a house to live in? Do they feel safe? These are the things that actually have, do they have access to fresh fruits? These are the things that impact the microbiome and the epigenetic factors in ways that we not even ask, not in our clinic, and we don't even ask in research. That's why I think that there's a big time. Now listen, I also think about data dissemination. I would no more say to somebody, hey, look, this is a spot on your left lung, and it's not your film, and yeah, that's not exactly where it is, but you know, this just gives you a rough idea. But yet we do that with data when we talk about communities. Instead of saying, hey, listen, you have a left upper lobe, spot that we're worried about. This is your spot, Mr. Jones. This is your CAT scan. And here's what we're going to do. So I've made an approach about how to address this issue. And in fact, one of the things about this is that we now have the ability, and we'll be doing this in Richmond as well and throughout Virginia, the ability to personalize community data. So yeah, we can tell you, this is just some background. Chicago is made up of 50 different wards. A ward is comprised of 50 to 75,000 people in a particular ward. And yeah, we can give all the demographics, but this was the money. We were able then to talk to aldermen who lived in these different wards, the fact that they had 3 times the number of people dying from prostate cancer than they did in the nation and the state. That changed the conversation because it personalized the data. And I've said to someone as a basic scientist, basic/translational scientist, it's amazing how comfortable we are with the history of epithelial cell cancers in lung, that they derive from dysfunctional epithelial cells. And that was the history that we had until Joan Brugge and Ming Bissell and others started talking about the fact that there was stroma. And the stroma around the epithelial cells weren't inert. In fact, there was this back and forth. So why are we so comfortable talking about a single epithelial cell getting dysregulated, but it has communication with the stroma impact, but yet we're uncomfortable talking about a single individual that lives in a community, i.e. the stroma, that if the community is unhealthy, there's probably higher risks of the person being unhealthy. Shouldn't be a surprise. I'll end on the following. As a result of this cancer center and my approach has been very different in the context of loving science, but how do I make sure that we are bringing our communities closer to science? One of the ways we did was as a result of Bishop Gerald Glenn's death, where he famously said, God is larger than COVID. Many of you know the story. He died. Several of the members of his congregation came down with COVID as well as his family. And ultimately what we learned from COVID was that anchor communities matter. Anchors within our anchor institutions matter. Now, people say, well, Dr. Winn, how'd you come up with this Fact Faith Friday? It was out of necessity. Libraries, which is an anchor institutions, were closed. Schools that actually, particularly the after-school programs that were not just for kids, but families, were closed. And as Martin Luther King pointed out, when he talked about the pillars of most communities, and particularly African-American communities, turns out the clergy was the only thing that was really active. We even had some nonprofits that were closed. So after a conversation with Rudine Mercer Haynes, who, by the way, I love, she is talking about an outstanding, someone who I'd like to be like when I grow up. She was amazing, and she understood my desire to reach out and to be able to educate or give practical information to the people in the community, and Pastor Gray's ability to sort of mobilize. We together formed the Facts and Faith Friday, which we meet between 3 and 4 every Friday to give the most expert opinions of external advisors like, Fauci, and internal people within our ranks, like even the Norm Oliver and other people within the VCU, to actually make sure that these folks, these faith-based leaders, actually have the most information. Now, why faith-based leaders? Turns out that right during the height of this pandemic, that for better or for worse, people were not believing scientists, nor were they believing doctors in the information that was being passed to them. They were suspect and suspicious of our data and our information. But the funny part was that these pastors, if they said it, people not only in their congregations, but people from their community who looked towards them would buy that. And so we formed Facts Faith Fridays. I will take some credit that I came up with the Friday part, but Pastor Gray and Rudine came up with the rest. Again, it was important not only to bring internal leaders that we have, and actually people from the governor's office and from the mayor's office to talk to these folks, but also Dr. Fauci and Ned Sharpless and others who I invited. What does this remind you of? That we essentially are back to probably having our green book. There is so much chatter, misinformation and disinformation. The community is asking, right, for believable data. And I am of the opinion, probably blue collar, that the days of just doing high tech is not enough. Necessary, but not sufficient. We need to not only take a high tech approach, but a high touch approach. And it's that high touch that is going to be really the secret sauce that we in the scientific and medical community are going to have to get back to our roots of being reconnected to the community in ways that we have gotten away from. So I'd end with that and tell you that this is my grandmother, 95, and I mean, she's a hoop. And she's a woman that really has done a lot in shaping my life in the framework of the two principles that she would call the two things that any man or woman needs in life is grace and humility. And with that, I will finish and just say I've probably overstayed my welcome. I apologize, but I just wanted to just say thank you again for the invite to give this talk. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to take them. Thank you.
A couple of questions here. One is, this is from Dr. Gawanter, how can we practice in precision medicine if payers and PBMs limit the ability of providers and patients to decide upon what therapies are the best?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to roll up your sleeves with you. And in fact, that's one of the things we are actually doing and talking about at CMS and other programs right now about the fact of the matter is that we have handcuffed ourselves we have the promise on the one hand of precision medicine. And on the other hand, we again, don't really have full buy-in. So we are working with the NCCN and many other groups to actually do that. I also should tell you that this is probably going to be part of an initiative that we call the Health Equity Report Card. And so you may have heard some rumblings about that. You can blame me. As we talked about quality measures and safety measures, I've actually sort of said, well, what's not measured is not done. And so we are actually, taking to Congress now that looks like it may work, this issue called the equity report card. Within that equity report card, we're not sneaking in. I don't sneak in anything. I'm just putting it out there, this issue around better use of precision medicine, because I do believe that having payers and others pay for at least aspects of precision medicine and the application of that is an additional way of reducing the disparities gap, whether they exist in rural areas, urban underserved areas, or even in our suburbs. So stay tuned, but you're absolutely right. We're not going to get this done just because it's right. There's going to have to be political action. And I think and with your help, we'll be able to create a kind of noise that I think will at least get the attention for people to readdress this issue. So hopefully that was helpful.
Dr. Winn, I'm sorry I temporarily lost my my screen. Always something. But thank you so much. What an inspiring presentation, and you can really sense your passion. And I know I speak for many in the Academy who are listening, I'm sure, who are ready to help you meet your goals. There are a few more questions here. What can we as individual physicians do to affect changes in racial health disparities?
What a great question. And so lots of different ways, but I think one, and the simplest sort of advice, but the hardest one, is really to hit the pause button when you're taking care of different patients. I'll give you a quick example, and most of us are blind to this, but it's one of the things. I'm actually having another national campaign with Nadine Barrett called Ask First. We keep saying, why aren't there minorities on our clinical trials? It turns out it's not because they would say no more frequently than anybody else. It turns out that just like in middle school, we're afraid to ask because we're afraid of being told no. So we're going to have a national Ask First campaign where we really are going to, and this is part of the Health Equity Report Card that we're trying to stimulate, and I'm trying to get out there, and it looks like it's getting some traction, that don't make assumptions about your patients and what they'll do and what they won't do. Ask them. If I had one simple piece of advice, it's when it comes to things like clinical trials, or when it comes to, well, this patient should probably get this surgery or maybe this procedure, don't assume for them. Ask. Now, that's only one super small thing, But man, can you imagine if many of us actually did that? We could see an impact and an effect. So I have a laundry list of things, if I had another hour and a half, but I don't, that I would love to share with you. And one of the other things I was going to say would be to please knock on my door. And I know we have Peter Buckley, who's our dean, who's outstanding, by the way, who I really like a lot, who for our health system and through the college, and even at UVA, we're doing things in these institutions. Let's partner up and start thinking about what we can do more, because I think that in addition to what we're doing at the Cancer Center, there are a whole host of things that you guys are doing, and particularly at the Richmond Academy. So I think now's the time to have those discussions and those partnerships and even come up with even more things. But a simple thing, please stop assuming. Let's start asking.
Absolutely. Can you maybe discuss how the School of Medicine is getting involved in, is this part of the curriculum? Are you at all involved with that?
What I really love about that is that this is, again, where leadership matters. And so under President Rao and Dean Buckley and now, Art Kellerman, they are certainly paying, and in fact, probably even before the George Floyd, but since the George Floyd incident and all these things, there is a heightened awareness of these activities and putting these things together. So I think you would, if you came to our campus, you see a flurry of activity around this issue of addressing these disparities. And again, I want to remind people that for me, when you say rural, it just doesn't mean white in Virginia. What I love about Virginia is that you have a history of having African Americans who have been owning farms and things like that for years. And so there's a diversity even in a rural population. So I have to be honest with you, I love Virginia and I love Richmond. I couldn't imagine being at any place at any time than here, right now with you all. We have the ability to do some cool things and we're going to push it forward. So I think many of the schools are, talking with Dr. Dean Buckley, you'd probably find out even a huge number more, but we're doing some cool things with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, when I think of diversity, I don't always think of only Black. It's not Black-white. It hasn't been Black-white since the 1950s and 1960s, y'all. We're definitely thinking about a pluralistic sort of group of people. In my mind is always how I can benefit a disparities when I see it, just like I explained about the differences in Norway.
Thank you very much. I think we have a few more questions, but I think we're a little past our time. And so we'd like to respect your time as well, but we look forward to having more discussions with you in the future.
Thank you. And I look forward to actually working with you guys. I mean, I'm super happy that you gave me the invite to be part of RAM and looking forward to being a part of this for a long time coming. And
we have to thank Boyd Winslow for bringing you to our attention too. Thanks, Boyd. Take care. Have a good evening, everybody.
Good evening. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.